The fluorescent lights above hummed their sterile tune as I sat beside Bob's hospital bed, watching the monitors track what little life remained in my husband of 32 years. His hand felt paper thin in mine, all warmth seemingly drained from the man who once swept me off my feet at a college dance in 1992. The oxygen mask fogged with each labored breath, and I found myself counting the seconds between each rise and fall of his chest. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical symphony of machines keeping him alive. I leaned closer, my ear nearly touching his lips. "I need to tell you something." My heart clenched. After 3 days of doctors preparing me for the worst, I thought I was ready for anything. A final declaration of love, perhaps. Maybe regret about the vacation we'd planned for our anniversary next month. I squeezed his hand gently, trying to pour all my love into that simple touch. "What is it, honey?" I whispered back, brushing a strand of gray hair from his forehead. Even now, even like this, I thought he was handsome. The same kind eyes that had looked at me across countless dinner tables, the same gentle smile that had comforted me through my mother's death 5 years ago. Bob's eyes, once bright blue and full of mischief, now seemed clouded with something I couldn't identify. Fear? Guilt? He turned his head slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might drift off again. The morphine had been making him drowsy, causing him to slip in and out of consciousness throughout the day. "Promise me something," he said, his grip on my hand suddenly tightening with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't hate me." I felt my breath catch. "Bob, I could never hate you. You're my everything. You've been my whole world for 32 years. He closed his eyes, and I saw a single tear escape down his cheek. In all our years together, I'd only seen Bob cry twice. Once when his father died, and once when Michael graduated college. This was different. This was the cry of a man carrying a weight I couldn't understand. "Don't hate me for what you'll find in my office," he whispered, each word seeming to cost him tremendous effort. "The file cabinet, bottom drawer, there's a key taped under my desk drawer. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." My mind raced, trying to process his words. What could possibly be in his office that would make me hate him? Bob ran a successful accounting firm with his partner, David. He was meticulous, organized, honest to a fault. What could he possibly need to apologize for? "Bob, you're scaring me. What are you talking about?" I asked, but his eyes had already closed again, and his breathing had become more shallow. The next morning, the monitors fell silent. 2 days later, I stood in Bob's home office still wearing the black dress from his funeral. The house felt impossibly quiet without his presence. Emma and Michael had returned to their own lives, and I was alone with my grief and his cryptic final words. I found the key exactly where he said it would be. A small brass key taped under the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. My hands trembled as I peeled away the old tape. The file cabinet in the corner had always been locked, and I'd never questioned it. Bob always said it contained boring business documents and tax records. Standing there with that key in my palm, I realized I was about to discover why my dying husband had begged me not to hate him. Whatever waited behind that locked drawer would either destroy my memories of our marriage or confirm that the man I'd loved and trusted completely had been living a lie. I had no idea that in the next few minutes I would discover that everything I believed about my life, my marriage, and myself was about to crumble completely. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Before that devastating moment in the hospital, I lived in what I believe was a beautiful love story. Bob and I had built what everyone called the perfect marriage, the kind that made other couples slightly envious at dinner parties. We were Sarah and Bob Chen, the couple who still held hands during movies, who had survived the teenage years with Emma and Michael, without losing ourselves in the chaos of parenthood. Our mornings began the same way for over 20 years. Bob would wake up first, padding to the kitchen in his worn blue robe to start the coffee. I'd find him at our breakfast table with the newspaper spread before him, steam rising from 2 matching mugs. His black, mine with a splash of cream. "Good morning, beautiful," he'd say without looking up, and I'd kiss the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. Sunday mornings were sacred. After church, we'd return home and tackle the New York Times crossword puzzle together. Bob handled the sports clues and political references, while I conquered the literature and pop culture questions. "What's a 7-letter word for betrayal?" he'd ask, and I'd lean over his shoulder, pencil poised, completely unaware of the irony that would later haunt me. I'd sacrificed my teaching career when Emma was born, choosing to be the foundation that allowed Bob to build his accounting practice. While he worked late nights and weekend meetings, I managed our home, raised our children, and supported his dreams without question. "You're the reason I can do what I do," he'd tell me when I'd bring him dinner at the office. "I couldn't have built this without you." The evidence of our happiness filled every corner of our suburban home. Photo albums documented family vacations to our lake house in Michigan. Christmas mornings with the kids tearing through wrapping paper. Anniversary dinners where Bob would surprise me with reservations at whatever restaurant had caught my attention that month. He remembered everything. How I liked my tea, that I preferred daisies to roses, that I always ordered the salmon when we went to our favorite Italian place. Our friends saw us as the couple who had figured it out. Linda Martinez, my best friend since college, would often shake her head in amazement. "How do you two still act like newlyweds after 30 years? She'd ask. Bob would wink at me across the room and say, "I married my best friend. That's the secret." Every Friday evening, Bob would arrive home with flowers, usually daisies, sometimes tulips in spring. "Just because," he'd say, kissing my cheek as he handed them over. I'd arrange them in the crystal vase we'd received as a wedding gift, placing them on our dining room table where they'd brighten the room for the next week. It was such a small gesture, but it made me feel cherished, seen, loved. Our intimacy wasn't just physical, though Bob remained affectionate even as we aged. He'd reach for my hand during movies, pull me close on the couch while we watched the evening news, and always kiss me goodnight, even after our worst arguments. But it was the emotional intimacy that I treasured most, the way he'd ask about my day and actually listen, how he'd remember details about my volunteer work at the library, the way he'd defend me if someone made a thoughtless comment about my cooking or my choices. I thought I knew everything about him, his favorite coffee shop, the way he liked his shirts ironed, how he'd get quiet when he was solving a particularly complex problem at work. I knew he was proud of our children, that he worried about retirement finances, that he still got nervous before big client presentations, despite decades of experience. Looking back now, I realize I was living in a beautiful illusion, a carefully constructed facade that Bob had built around our marriage. I was so busy being the perfect wife to what I thought was the perfect husband that I never questioned whether the man I loved so completely was actually the man sleeping beside me every night. I was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones that feel like love. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a Tuesday evening in March, during what should have been one of our most romantic moments. Bob had made reservations at Chez Laurent, the upscale French restaurant where we'd celebrated our engagement 33 years earlier. It was our 30th wedding anniversary, and I had spent the afternoon getting ready, choosing the navy dress he'd always complimented, styling my hair the way he liked it. "You look stunning," he said as I descended the stairs, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. He helped me into my coat, opened the car door, and during the drive, we talked about Emma's new promotion and Michael's upcoming graduate school applications. I felt grateful for this life we'd built together, for a husband who still prioritized romantic gestures after 3 decades. The restaurant was exactly as I remembered. Dim lighting, soft piano music, the scent of garlic and fresh herbs floating from the kitchen. Our table by the window overlooked the city lights, and Bob had even requested the same corner booth where he'd proposed all those years ago. I reached across the table to touch his hand, feeling emotional about the significance of the moment. "Can you believe it's been 30 years?" I asked, smiling at him. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've lived several lifetimes together." But Bob wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something over my shoulder, and I turned to see what had captured his attention. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just other couples enjoying their meals, the soft glow of candles, the familiar rhythm of a restaurant in full swing. "Bob," I said gently, and he snapped back to attention. "Sorry, sweetheart, just thinking about work." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You were saying?" Before I could respond, his phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen, and I watched his expression change, a flash of something I'd never seen before. Excitement? Anxiety? He quickly flipped the phone face down. "Probably just David with a question about the Morrison account," he said, but his voice sounded different, tighter. The phone buzzed again and again. Each time, Bob's jaw tensed slightly, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm I didn't recognize. This wasn't the calm, collected man I'd married. This was someone on edge, distracted, somewhere else entirely. "Maybe you should check it," I suggested after the fourth buzz. "If it's important—" "It's not important," he said sharply, cutting me off. The other diners at nearby tables glanced over, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Bob had never spoken to me like that in public, never made me feel embarrassed in front of strangers. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, reaching for my hand. "I'm just stressed about this new client. You know how I get when work gets complicated." I nodded, wanting to believe him, but something felt off. The phone buzzed again, and this time Bob couldn't resist. He lifted it slightly, angling it away from me, and I caught a glimpse of him typing quickly. His fingers moved with purpose, not the hesitant hunt and peck I was used to seeing when he answered work emails. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," I read over his shoulder before he could angle the phone completely away. My heart skipped. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Bob never had client meetings on Wednesdays. It was the day he used to catch up on paperwork and return calls. I'd been married to him long enough to know his schedule by heart. "New client?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "What?" He looked up, and for just a moment I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. Guilt. "Oh yes, very demanding. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. In 30 years of marriage, Bob had never been secretive about his work. He'd always shared details about difficult clients, celebrated new contracts, complained about unreasonable deadlines. This careful vagueness was new, and it felt like a door closing between us. As we drove home that night, I found myself staring at Bob's profile in the dashboard light, wondering when he'd started feeling like a stranger. The weeks following our anniversary dinner brought a slow, insidious change that I initially attributed to work stress. Bob had always been attentive, but now I found myself competing with his phone for his attention, losing conversations to the soft glow of his screen, and feeling increasingly invisible in my own home. It started with the small things. During our nightly routine of watching the evening news together, Bob would sit on the opposite end of the couch, his phone in his lap, occasionally chuckling at something on the screen. When I'd ask what was funny, he'd dismiss it with a wave of his hand. "Just a meme David sent," he'd say. But David had never been the type to share memes. I'd known him for 15 years, and humor wasn't exactly his strong suit. Our dinner conversations became one-sided performances, where I'd share news about my volunteer work at the library, updates about Emma's career, or stories about my book club, only to realize Bob was nodding absently while scrolling through messages. "That's nice, honey," became his default response to everything, delivered with the same distracted tone he'd used to acknowledge background noise. The erosion accelerated during social gatherings. At the Hendersons' barbecue in May, I found myself standing alone while Bob huddled with a group of men by the grill, his phone perpetually in his hand. When Margaret Henderson asked about our recent trip to visit Emma in Seattle, I launched into a story about the Pike Place Market and the wonderful restaurant we'd discovered. "Bob, tell them about that amazing salmon you ordered," I called out, trying to include him in the conversation. He looked up briefly, his expression blank. "What salmon?" The embarrassment hit me like a physical blow. We'd been talking about that dinner for days, how it was the best meal we'd had in years. "At that restaurant overlooking the water," I prompted. "You said it was better than the salmon at Chez Laurent." "Oh, right," he said, but his attention was already drifting back to his phone. "It was good." Margaret's sympathetic smile made my cheeks burn. I could see her exchanging glances with the other women, that knowing look that said they'd all been there, feeling forgotten by their own husbands. At home, Bob began treating me like a household manager rather than a wife. He'd leave notes on the kitchen counter about dry cleaning that needed to be picked up, remind me about social obligations, as if I were his secretary, and discuss our finances with the detached tone of someone reviewing a business account. "We need to cut back on the grocery budget," he announced one evening, not looking up from his laptop. "The expenses are getting out of hand." I stared at him across the kitchen island. "Bob, I've been managing our household budget for 30 years. I know exactly what we spend." "I'm just saying we need to be more careful," he replied, still typing. "Maybe you could shop at that discount place instead of the regular grocery store." The suggestion stung. I'd always been frugal, careful with money, proud of how I stretched our household budget. But more than that, it was the way he said it, as if I were an employee receiving instructions rather than his partner in life. The final blow came during Emma's birthday call. I'd spent the afternoon making her favorite cake, the same chocolate recipe I'd used for 28 years. As I held the phone so Bob could talk to our daughter, I mentioned the cake. "Your mother's getting sentimental in her old age," Bob said with a laugh that didn't sound affectionate. "Making cakes for people who live 3,000 miles away." Emma's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Later, she'd call me back privately. "Mom, is everything okay with you and Dad?" I assured her everything was fine, but as I hung up, I realized I'd been making excuses for Bob's behavior for weeks. When had his teasing become dismissive? When had his distraction become disregard? When had I become someone he tolerated rather than treasured? That night, lying in bed beside a man who felt like a stranger, I wondered if I was losing my mind or if I was simply losing my husband. The Riverside Country Club's annual charity gala was always the social event of the season, and I'd been looking forward to it for months. It was one of the few times Bob and I would dress up, dance, and remind ourselves why we'd fallen in love in the first place. I'd bought a new dress, a deep emerald green that complemented my eyes, and spent extra time on my hair and makeup. When I came downstairs that evening, I felt beautiful and confident for the first time in weeks. "You look lovely," Bob said, but his tone was perfunctory, like he was checking off a social obligation. He was already scrolling through his phone, even though we were running late. The ballroom was decorated with twinkling lights and white roses, and I felt a flutter of excitement as we walked in together. This was our community, our friends, our world. Surely here, surrounded by people who knew us as the devoted couple we'd always been, things would feel normal again. Bob immediately gravitated toward the bar, leaving me to navigate the sea of familiar faces alone. I chatted with Linda Martinez about her son's wedding plans, discussed the library's new literacy program with several board members, and complimented Martha Stevens on her stunning necklace. But I kept glancing over at Bob, hoping he'd join me, hoping we'd have at least one dance together. After an hour of mingling, I decided to find him. I needed to use the restroom anyway, and I thought we could walk back into the ballroom together, perhaps finally have that romantic moment I'd been craving. As I rounded the corner near the men's lounge, I heard Bob's distinctive laugh, the deep, genuine laugh he used to reserve for my stories, for our private moments. But he wasn't laughing with me. He was standing with David Romano and two other men from the club, all of them holding drinks and looking completely at ease. "Marriage is like a comfortable old chair," I heard Bob say, his voice carrying that jovial tone he used when telling jokes. "You don't really notice it anymore, but you'd miss it if it was gone." The other men chuckled, and David leaned in closer. "At least your chair doesn't ask where you've been every night," he said with a conspiratorial grin. The laughter that followed was loud and hearty, the kind of bonding laughter that men share when they think no one else is listening. I stood frozen behind the decorative pillar, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. "Sarah's been extra clingy lately," Bob continued, and I felt the blood drain from my face. "Always wanting to know about my schedule, asking about work calls. I swear, sometimes I feel like I'm married to a security guard." More laughter. David raised his glass. "Here's to understanding wives who know when to give their husbands space." I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself invisible, but I couldn't move away. I couldn't stop listening to my husband of 30 years describe me like I was a burden, a nuisance, something to be endured rather than cherished. "The worst part," Bob said, lowering his voice slightly, "is when she tries to be romantic. Last week she wanted to slow dance in the kitchen while I was checking emails. I mean, we're not 20 anymore, you know?" That slow dance. It had been a spontaneous moment when our old wedding song came on the radio. I thought it was sweet, a reminder of our younger selves. Bob had reluctantly put down his phone and held me for maybe 30 seconds before pulling away, claiming he had important work to review. I stood there in my beautiful green dress, feeling utterly humiliated. Around me, the gala continued. Couples dancing, friends laughing, the gentle hum of conversation and clinking glasses. But I felt completely alone, like I was watching it all from behind glass. When I finally found the strength to move, I walked directly to the ladies' room and locked myself in a stall, trying not to cry and ruin my makeup. I stayed there for 20 minutes, composing myself, before returning to the ballroom with a smile plastered on my face. Bob never even noticed I'd been gone. The confrontation came 3 days after the charity gala. I'd been carrying the weight of Bob's words, his casual cruelty, his dismissal of our marriage as something tedious and burdensome. Every time I looked at him, I heard his voice describing me as clingy and like a security guard. The hurt had crystallized into something harder, a need for honesty, for acknowledgement, for some kind of explanation. I waited until after dinner, when Bob had settled into his recliner with his laptop, as had become his nightly routine. The evening news played softly in the background, but his attention was entirely focused on his screen, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. I'd watched this scene play out for weeks, but tonight I couldn't let it continue. "Bob, we need to talk," I said, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. He didn't look up. "Can it wait? I'm in the middle of something important." "No, it can't wait." My voice was steadier than I felt. "I need to understand what's happening to us." That got his attention. He glanced up with an expression of mild irritation, like I'd interrupted him during a crucial business call. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, settling into the chair across from him. "I overheard you at the gala, the conversation with David and the other men, about marriage being like an old chair, about me being clingy." Bob's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, then something that looked almost like relief, like he was tired of pretending. "Sarah, that was just guy talk. You know how men are when they get together." "Guy talk?" I felt my composure wavering. "You described our marriage as something you barely notice. You made fun of me for wanting to dance with you in our own kitchen." "You're being overly sensitive." He closed his laptop with a sharp snap. "I can't even have a conversation with friends without you analyzing every word." "Friends don't mock their wives to other men, Bob. Partners don't dismiss each other's feelings as overly sensitive." Something shifted in his expression then, a hardness I'd never seen before. Maybe that's the problem, Sarah. Maybe you are too sensitive. Maybe you're suffocating me. The words hit like a physical blow, suffocating. In 30 years of marriage, Bob had never used that word about me, about us. I'm suffocating you. Yes. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. You want to know every detail about my day. You ask about every phone call, every meeting. You follow me around the house like a lost puppy. I can't breathe without you needing to know why I'm breathing. I sat in stunned silence. This man, angry and resentful, was not the Bob I'd married. This was someone who saw love as surveillance, attention as intrusion, connection as confinement. I need space, he continued, his back still to me. I need room to exist without feeling like I'm being watched and judged and questioned all the time. Space, I repeated quietly. Yes, space. Time to think without you hovering. Time to work without interruption. Time to just be myself without feeling like I'm disappointing you somehow. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. How much space do you need, Bob? I don't know. Maybe you could stay with Linda for a while. Give us both time to figure out what we really want. The suggestion felt like a door slamming shut. He wasn't asking for a break. He was asking me to leave. After 30 years of building a life together, he wanted me gone so he could breathe freely. Okay, I said simply. He turned around, clearly expecting an argument. Okay? If that's what you need, then that's what you'll get. I walked past him, toward the stairs. I'll pack a bag. I spent the next 20 minutes gathering clothes, toiletries, and a few personal items, while Bob remained downstairs. He didn't come up to talk, didn't try to soften his words, didn't seem to realize that he'd just asked his wife of 3 decades to leave their home. As I carried my suitcase down the stairs, Bob looked up from his laptop, which he'd already reopened. This is just temporary, he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. I know, I replied, though I was beginning to understand that nothing about this was temporary. I was about to discover what my marriage looked like when I wasn't in it. Linda Martinez opened her front door to find me standing on her porch at 9:47 p.m., suitcase in hand and tears streaming down my face. She didn't ask questions. She simply pulled me inside, made tea, and listened as I explained how my husband of 30 years had just asked me to leave our home because I was suffocating him. Stay as long as you need, she said, leading me to her guest room. We'll figure this out together. But as the days turned into a week, I began to realize there might be nothing to figure out. Bob didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't seem to miss me at all. When I drove past our house on my way to the library, I could see lights on in his office until late at night, and I wondered if he was enjoying his newfound freedom as much as he'd hoped. The financial reality hit me on the 5th day. I'd gone to the bank to withdraw money for groceries, only to discover that Bob had been making large cash withdrawals from our joint checking account. Withdrawals I knew nothing about. $3,000 here, $1,500 there, amounts that individually might not have raised flags, but together represented a significant drain on our savings. When did these withdrawals happen? I asked the teller, pointing to the most recent transactions. Let me check. Looks like they've been happening over the past 6 months, she said, scrolling through the computer screen. All from the downtown branch. Downtown. Bob's office was in the suburbs, and he rarely had business downtown. My hands shook as I looked at the statement, trying to make sense of the numbers. We'd always been so careful with money, so transparent about our spending. I managed the household budget, but Bob handled the larger financial decisions, and I'd trusted him completely. That evening, I called our accountant, hoping for some explanation. Jerry, it's Sarah Chen. I have some questions about our finances. Sarah, I'm so sorry about what you and Bob are going through, Jerry said, his voice careful and professional. but I'm afraid I can't discuss your financial situation without Bob's authorization. Jerry, these are joint accounts. I'm on everything. I understand, but Bob specifically asked me to direct all financial inquiries through him. He said you were going through a difficult time and he wanted to handle the stress of money management. I hung up feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Bob had essentially cut me off from information about our own finances, painting me as unstable, someone who couldn't handle the stress of knowing about our money. After 30 years of managing our household budget flawlessly, he'd made me seem incompetent to our own accountant. The isolation was perhaps worse than the financial uncertainty. Our couple friends, the Hendersons, the Millers, the Johnsons, seemed to have chosen sides without ever asking for my version of events. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls became awkward and brief. I realized that in 30 years of marriage, I'd defined myself so completely as Bob's wife that I'd forgotten how to be just Sarah. I started spending entire days in Linda's guest room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd become so dependent on someone who clearly didn't want me around. The woman who'd raised 2 children, managed a household, and supported her husband's career had somehow become someone who couldn't even access her own bank account without permission. The lowest point came on a Tuesday afternoon when I ran into David Romano at the grocery store. Bob's business partner looked uncomfortable when he saw me, shifting his weight from foot to foot as we stood in the produce section. "How are you holding up, Sarah?" he asked, but his tone was patronizing, like he was speaking to someone he considered mentally fragile. "I'm fine, David. Just doing some shopping." "That's good. Bob mentioned you were having some difficulties. I'm glad you're getting the help you need." Help I need. As if I were the problem. As if I were the one who'd broken our marriage vows, who'd started making secretive financial transactions, who'd asked for space from the person who'd loved me unconditionally for 3 decades. I stood there among the apples and oranges, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life, wondering if everyone in our circle believed I was the unstable one, the difficult wife who couldn't handle her husband's success. That night, I called Bob. "I want to come home," I said when he answered. "I don't think that's a good idea yet," he replied, his voice distant and final. Bob's heart attack came without warning on a Thursday morning in September. I was at Linda's house drinking coffee and pretending to read the newspaper when Emma called me, sobbing. "Mom, you need to get to Riverside General right now. Dad collapsed at the office." I drove to the hospital in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the separation and the hurt, Bob was still my husband. He was still the father of my children, still the man I'd planned to grow old with. The thought of losing him forever made me realize that anger and love could coexist in the same shattered heart. He lived for 3 more days, drifting in and out of consciousness while machines monitored his failing body. It was during one of his lucid moments that he gripped my hand and whispered those haunting words about not hating him for what I'd find in his office. I thought he was delirious from the medication, talking nonsense in his final hours. The funeral was a blur of black clothes, sympathy casseroles, and well-meaning neighbors who told me how devoted Bob and I had been to each other. Emma and Michael flanked me during the service, and I drew strength from their presence, even as I questioned everything I thought I knew about their father. 2 days after we buried Bob, I finally found the courage to enter his home office. The room smelled like his cologne and old paper, and for a moment, I almost turned around and left. But his last words haunted me, and I knew I'd never find peace until I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. I found the key exactly where he'd said it would be. A small brass key taped with yellowing Scotch tape under the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. My hands trembled as I peeled it away, the adhesive leaving a sticky residue on my fingertips. I'd walked past that desk thousands of times over the years, never knowing it held secrets that would reshape everything I believed about my marriage. The file cabinet stood in the corner like a silent sentinel, its dark metal surface reflecting the afternoon light streaming through the office windows. I'd always assumed it contained tax documents, business contracts, the mundane paperwork of Bob's accounting practice. The lock was small, almost insignificant, but turning that brass key felt like opening Pandora's box. The bottom drawer slid open with a soft whisper, revealing contents that made my breath catch in my throat. There, nestled among manila folders, was a second cell phone, newer than the one Bob carried, sleek and black and completely unfamiliar to me. Beside it lay a stack of hotel receipts bound with a rubber band, the dates going back over 5 years. The Marriott downtown, the Hilton by the airport, weekend getaways to resorts I'd never heard of, all charged to credit cards I didn't know existed. But it was the folder labeled Property Investment, in Bob's careful handwriting, that made my legs go weak. Inside were documents for a lakeside cabin in Pine Valley, 2 hours north of our city. Purchase agreement, deed, mortgage papers, all bearing Bob's signature alone, all dated 3 years ago. The down payment of $50,000 had come from our joint savings account, money I'd thought was being invested in retirement funds. My marriage certificate was also in that drawer, along with photocopies of our joint bank statements and what appeared to be a second set of books for Bob's accounting practice. There were receipts for expensive jewelry I'd never seen, restaurant bills for romantic dinners I'd never attended, and travel confirmations for trips Bob had supposedly taken alone for business. At the very bottom of the drawer, tucked beneath everything else, was a single photograph. Bob stood on the deck of the lakeside cabin, his arm around a woman I'd never seen before. She was younger than me, with auburn hair and a bright smile, and she was wearing a diamond necklace that cost more than my car. On the back, someone had written, "Bob and Jessica, Spring 2022," in feminine handwriting. I sank into Bob's desk chair, the photograph trembling in my hands. Jessica. Who was Jessica? And how long had she been sharing the life I thought belonged to me? The second phone buzzed suddenly, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. A text message appeared on the locked screen. "Missing you. When can we talk about the cabin?" I stared at that message until the screen went dark, finally understanding why Bob had begged me not to hate him. He hadn't just asked for space in our marriage. He'd been living an entirely separate life. I sat in Bob's office chair for what felt like hours, staring at that photograph of my husband with another woman, feeling like I was looking at evidence from someone else's life. The rational part of my mind tried to find innocent explanations. Maybe Jessica was a client, maybe the cabin was a legitimate business investment, maybe there was some reasonable explanation for the secret phone and the hotel receipts. But deep in my chest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. The fog of confusion that had surrounded me during our separation, the self-doubt that had eaten away at my confidence, the constant questioning of my own perceptions. It all began to lift, like morning mist. I wasn't losing my mind. I hadn't been overly sensitive or suffocating. The distance I'd felt from Bob, the secretiveness, the dismissive comments, the sudden need for space, it all made perfect sense now. He hadn't fallen out of love with me, he'd fallen in love with someone else. The second phone buzzed again. This time I managed to catch a glimpse of another message. "Can't wait for our weekend at the cabin. I've missed our sanctuary." Our sanctuary. Those words hit me like a physical blow, but strangely, they also brought relief. For months, I'd been trying to fix a marriage that was already broken, trying to win back a man who was already gone, trying to be less of who I was so I could fit into the space he was willing to give me. I stood up slowly, my legs still shaky, and walked to the window that overlooked our backyard. The garden I'd tended for 30 years spread out before me. Roses I'd planted the year Emma was born, the apple tree we'd bought when Michael started kindergarten, the stone pathway Bob had laid one summer when we were still young and full of dreams. For the first time in months, I could breathe fully. The crushing weight of trying to understand what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a wife, why I wasn't enough for the man I'd loved completely, it was gone. I hadn't failed. I'd simply been competing with a ghost, trying to win a game where the rules had been changed without my knowledge. I picked up the photograph again, studying the woman named Jessica. She looked happy, confident, completely unaware that she was sharing Bob with someone else. I wondered if she knew about me, about our children, about the 30 years of marriage that Bob had been living parallel to their relationship. Or had he told her the same lies he'd probably told himself? That his marriage was loveless, that he was trapped, that he deserved happiness? The irony wasn't lost on me. While I'd been at Linda's house, drowning in self-doubt and wondering if I was too needy, too clingy, too much, Bob had been living a double life that required far more emotional energy than our marriage ever had. The man who claimed I was suffocating him had been maintaining relationships with at least 2 women, managing secret finances, and orchestrating elaborate deceptions. I laughed then, a sound that surprised me with its clarity. It wasn't bitter laughter. It was the laughter of recognition, of puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. All those late nights working, all those weekend business trips, all those moments when he'd seemed distracted and distant. He'd been living another life entirely. My phone rang and I saw Emma's name on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "Mom, how are you doing? I know being in Dad's office must be hard." I looked around the room that had held so many secrets, at the evidence of betrayal scattered across the desk, at the photograph of my husband with another woman. "Actually, honey, I think I'm going to be okay." And for the first time in months, I meant it. I wasn't the woman who'd been asked to leave her own home because she was too much trouble. I was the woman who'd been faithful and loving and honest for 30 years. I was the woman who'd raised 2 wonderful children and built a beautiful home and supported her husband's dreams, even when those dreams had grown to include someone else. The morning after my discovery, I woke up in Linda's guest room with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. Instead of lying in bed, drowning in sorrow, I made a list. Not an emotional, tear-stained list of grievances, but a practical, methodical plan of action. If Bob had been strategic about his deception, I could be strategic about my response. My first stop was downtown to see Margaret Walsh, the attorney who'd handled our wills years ago. I called her office and made an appointment under my maiden name, Sarah Morrison, not wanting word to get back to Bob's business associates before I was ready. "I need to understand my legal rights," I told Margaret, sitting across from her mahogany desk with a folder containing copies of everything I'd found. "My husband passed away recently, and I've discovered some financial irregularities." Margaret's expression grew increasingly serious as I showed her the documents: the secret cabin purchase, the hotel receipts, the evidence of the hidden relationship. "Sarah, this appears to be deliberate concealment of marital assets. The good news is that anything purchased with joint funds during your marriage is considered marital property, regardless of whose name is on the deed." She explained that the cabin, the secret credit cards, even the money Bob had withdrawn from our accounts, it was all part of our joint estate now that he was gone. "You'll need a forensic accountant to trace all the financial transactions, but based on what you've shown me, you may be entitled to recover significant assets." My next stop was First National Bank, where I met with a financial advisor named Susan Chen. No relation, despite sharing Bob's surname. I opened my own checking and savings accounts, transferring half of what remained in our joint accounts before anyone could question my right to access our money. "I'd like to set up direct deposit for any income streams," I told Susan, "and I need to understand all of our investment accounts and insurance policies." As we reviewed our financial portfolio, I discovered that Bob had been far wealthier than I'd realized. There were investment accounts I'd never heard of, a substantial life insurance policy that named me as the sole beneficiary, and business assets that were worth considerably more than he'd ever mentioned. I spent the afternoon at the library researching property records and using the public computers to avoid leaving digital trails on Linda's home network. The Pine Valley cabin was worth nearly $400,000, money that had been taken from our retirement savings without my knowledge or consent. That evening, I drove past the cabin address, following the GPS through winding country roads until I found the secluded property. It was beautiful. Exactly the kind of retreat Bob and I had talked about buying for our retirement. The irony cut deep, but it also fueled my resolve. He'd used our shared dreams to build a private world with someone else. I parked across the road and took photographs with my phone, documenting the property and the expensive cars in the driveway. Through the window, I could see the warm glow of lights and the movement of people inside. Jessica was there, living in the sanctuary that my marriage had unwittingly funded. Back at Linda's house, I began organizing everything I'd learned into a comprehensive file. Financial records, property documents, photographs, timeline of events. I was building a case, though I wasn't sure yet what kind of case it would become. I also started making subtle inquiries about Bob's business. I called the office, ostensibly to ask about final arrangements for his clients, but really to understand the scope of his professional relationships. David Romano was eager to help, offering to take care of everything in a way that made me wonder what exactly needed to be taken care of. "Bob would want me to look after you," David said during one phone call. "Maybe we should meet next week to discuss the business transition." I agreed to the meeting, but I was already planning to have my own attorney present. If Bob had been hiding assets from me, I suspected his business partner might know more than he was saying. Each night I reviewed my growing file of evidence, feeling stronger and more focused than I had in years. I wasn't seeking revenge, I was seeking truth. And for the first time since Bob's death, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. The meeting with David Romano was scheduled for Tuesday morning at Bob's accounting office, a place I'd visited countless times over the years to bring Bob lunch or discuss tax documents. This time, I arrived with my attorney, Margaret Walsh, and a briefcase full of financial records that David didn't know I possessed. David greeted me with an overly sympathetic smile and a patronizing pat on my shoulder. "Sarah, you look tired. I know this has been incredibly difficult for you." He gestured toward the conference room where Bob used to meet with clients. "Please sit down. I prepared some paperwork to make this transition as easy as possible for you." Margaret introduced herself, and I watched David's expression flicker with confusion. He clearly hadn't expected me to bring legal representation to what he'd assumed would be a simple conversation about winding down Bob's affairs. "I appreciate your concern, David," I said, settling into my chair with a calmness that surprised even me. "But before we discuss any transitions, I'd like to understand the complete financial picture of Bob's business interests." David shuffled through his papers, maintaining his confident demeanor. Of course. Bob was very successful, as you know. The business is worth approximately $200,000, and I'm prepared to offer you a fair buyout of his partnership share. $200,000, I repeated, making a note in my file. That's interesting. According to the tax documents I found in Bob's office, the business reported assets of over $800,000 last year. The color drained from David's face. "Well, you have to understand, Sarah, there are debts, overhead costs, depreciation." "I'm sure there are," I said smoothly. "That's why I'll need to see all the business records, bank statements, client contracts, accounts receivable, the complete books going back 5 years. Margaret leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen has also discovered some irregularities in her husband's personal finances that may be connected to business activities. We'll need full transparency to protect everyone's interests." David's confident facade was cracking. What kind of irregularities? I opened my briefcase and pulled out copies of the hotel receipts, the cabin documents and the bank statements showing the mysterious cash withdrawals. Large amounts of money that seemed to have been moved without proper documentation, a property purchase that I was unaware of, credit cards that weren't disclosed to me. "I don't know anything about Bob's personal finances," David said quickly, but his voice had risen an octave. "I'm sure you don't," I replied, "but some of these transactions originated from the business account. This withdrawal of $15,000, for instance." I pointed to a specific line on the bank statement. It was made the same day Bob allegedly took a business trip to Chicago, a trip that, according to these hotel receipts, actually took him to a resort in Colorado. David was sweating now, loosening his tie as he stared at the documents. "Look, Sarah, Bob handled his own affairs. I can't be responsible for what he did with his money." "Of course not," I said. "But as his business partner, you would have had to authorize large withdrawals from the business account, and you would have been aware if he was using company funds for personal expenses." Margaret placed a legal document on the table. "We're requesting a complete audit of the business finances. If everything is in order, you have nothing to worry about." David's hands shook as he picked up the document. "An audit? Sarah, surely we can work this out between friends. Bob wouldn't want his family dragged through a messy legal process." "Bob should have thought about that before he started hiding assets from his wife," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm not looking to destroy anyone, David. I just want what's rightfully mine." As we left the office, I could feel David's panic radiating behind us. The confident man who'd tried to lowball me into accepting a fraction of what I was owed was now scrambling to figure out how much I actually knew. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was David, his voice strained and desperate. "Sarah, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe we should meet again, just the two of us. I'm sure we can reach a more generous arrangement." I smiled as I declined his offer. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and David Romano was about to learn that underestimating the grieving widow had been his first mistake. I found Jessica Walsh's work address through the business directory at Bob's office. She was listed as a senior accountant at Morrison & Associates, a firm that had occasionally partnered with Bob's company on larger projects. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to approach her, but I knew this conversation was necessary for both of us to understand the full scope of Bob's deception. I waited in the parking lot of her office building, watching employees leave at the end of the workday, until I spotted the auburn-haired woman from the photograph. She was exactly as beautiful as her picture suggested. Professional, confident, walking toward a silver BMW with the kind of purposeful stride that spoke of success and self-assurance. "Excuse me," I called out as she reached her car. "Jessica Walsh?" She turned, and I saw recognition flicker across her face, not of me personally, but of the gravity of the moment. Somehow, she knew who I was before I even introduced myself. "You're Sarah," she said quietly, her keys hanging motionless in her hand. "Yes. I think we need to talk." Jessica's composure crumbled slightly, and for a moment she looked like what she was, a woman who'd been caught in the middle of something much larger than herself. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Could we go somewhere private? There are things we both need to understand." We drove separately to a quiet coffee shop downtown, neither of us speaking during the awkward process of ordering drinks and finding a corner table away from other customers. Jessica looked younger up close, probably in her mid-40s, with kind eyes that couldn't quite meet mine. "I know about the cabin," I said gently, not wanting to attack but needing to establish the facts. "I found the photos, the documents, the second phone." Jessica's hands wrapped around her coffee cup like an anchor. "He told me you were separated. He said you'd been living apart for over a year, that the divorce was just a matter of paperwork." The words hit me like a physical blow, but they also brought clarity. "We were separated for exactly 9 days before he died, Jessica. We'd been married for 30 years. She looked up sharply, her face pale. That's impossible. Bob and I have been together for almost 3 years. He told me his marriage had been over for a long time, that he was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos from our 30th anniversary dinner, just months before Bob's death. This was in March. He took me to the same restaurant where he proposed 33 years ago. Jessica stared at the photos, her expression shifting from confusion to horror to something that looked like rage. He was still taking you on anniversary dinners? Still playing the devoted husband? He never stopped being my husband, Jessica. Even when he asked me to leave the house, even when he claimed he needed space, he never mentioned divorce, never suggested our marriage was actually over. Tears began streaming down Jessica's face. He promised me we'd get married after the divorce was finalized. He said he was just being careful about the financial arrangements, making sure you'd be taken care of. God, I'm such an idiot. You're not an idiot, I said, surprising myself with how genuinely I meant it. You were lied to just as much as I was, maybe more. Jessica wiped her eyes with a napkin. The cabin was supposed to be our future home. He said it was an investment in our life together. I helped pick out the furniture, chose the paint colors. I thought we were building something real. We both thought we were building something real with him. She looked at me directly for the first time. What are you going to do now? I'm going to get my life back, I said. The question is, what are you going to do? Jessica was quiet for a long moment. He told me he loved me. He said I was the missing piece he'd been searching for his whole life. She laughed bitterly. I guess he was saying the same things to both of us. Probably, I agreed, but that doesn't make either of us stupid for believing him. It just makes him a liar. We sat in silence. Two women who'd loved the same man, who'd been betrayed by the same man, who were now left to piece together the truth from the fragments of his deception. I have something that belongs to you, Jessica said finally, reaching into her purse and pulling out a set of keys. The cabin keys. I can't keep going there, knowing what I know now. I took the keys, feeling their weight in my palm. Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for not hating me. As we parted ways, I realized that Jessica had been as much a victim as I was. Bob had stolen 3 years of her life, just as surely as he'd stolen the final months of our marriage. We'd both been loving a man who didn't exist. The call from Margaret Walsh came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after my confrontation with Jessica. I was in the middle of sorting through Bob's remaining possessions when her voice, tight with excitement, cut through my mundane task of deciding which ties to donate to charity. Sarah, you need to sit down. The forensic accountant has found something significant. I settled into Bob's desk chair, surrounded by banker's boxes and the detritus of a life I was still trying to understand. What kind of something? It appears Bob never updated his will after purchasing the cabin. According to the legal documents we found, everything, the cabin, the secret accounts, even the money he spent on Jessica, it all legally belongs to you as his surviving spouse. The irony was almost too perfect. Bob, who'd been so meticulous about hiding his double life, had been careless about the one document that mattered most. So the cabin is mine. Completely yours. But Sarah, that's not the most important discovery. Margaret's voice carried a weight that made my stomach tighten. The accountant found evidence that Bob and David Romano have been embezzling from client accounts for over 2 years. The words hung in the air like smoke. Embezzling? Large amounts. They were using client trust funds for personal investments, including the cabin purchase. Bob's cash withdrawals, the secret credit cards, even some of Jessica's expenses. It was all funded by money that belonged to their clients. I felt dizzy. How much money are we talking about? Nearly $500,000. The good news is that as Bob's widow, you're protected from criminal liability. The bad news is that David Romano is facing federal charges, and the business is about to be shut down by the state licensing board. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Bob's sudden wealth, his ability to afford an expensive cabin and maintain a secret life, it hadn't come from business success. It had come from stealing from people who trusted him with their life savings. "What happens now?" I asked. "The FBI wants to interview you. They need to understand what you knew about the business operations. And Sarah, they'll want to recover as much of the stolen money as possible for the victims." That afternoon, I sat across from two federal agents in my own living room, the same room where Bob and I had once hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties. Agent Rodriguez, a woman about Emma's age, was surprisingly gentle as she explained the scope of Bob's crimes. "We believe your husband was the primary architect of the scheme," she said. "Mr. Romano appears to have been a reluctant participant who got in over his head." "David always seemed nervous around Bob," I admitted. "I thought it was just personality differences." Agent Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, we know this is difficult, but we need to ask about your financial contributions to any of your husband's investments or purchases." "I never contributed anything directly. I didn't even know about most of these accounts." I pulled out the organized files I'd been building. "But I've documented everything I found after his death." The agent spent 2 hours reviewing my documentation, taking copies of receipts and bank statements. When they finished, Agent Rodriguez delivered news that shocked me more than anything else I'd discovered. "Mrs. Chen, your cooperation and the evidence you've provided will be instrumental in recovering funds for the victims. In appreciation, and because you were also victimized by your husband's deception, the court will likely allow you to retain the cabin as part of your legitimate marital assets." 3 months later, I received a letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office. David Romano had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the clients he'd helped defraud. The accounting firm was permanently closed, but most of the stolen money had been recovered and returned to its rightful owners. The final twist came with a hand-delivered envelope from David's attorney. Inside was a confession letter David had written, detailing how Bob had gradually pressured him into the embezzlement scheme, threatening to destroy his career if he didn't cooperate. "Bob Chen was a master manipulator," David had written. "He convinced me that we were just borrowing the money, that we'd pay it back before anyone noticed. By the time I realized we were in too deep, he owned me completely." I folded the letter carefully, finally understanding that Bob's capacity for deception had extended far beyond our marriage. He'd been a criminal who'd used everyone around him, his wife, his lover, his business partner, his clients, as instruments in his elaborate fraud. Justice, it seemed, had a sense of irony. The confrontation with Emma came 2 weeks after David Romano's sentencing. I was at the cabin, which had become my retreat for processing everything that had happened, when I heard a car pulling up the gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched my daughter emerge from her rental car, her face set with the same determined expression she'd worn as a toddler when she was about to deliver an ultimatum. I opened the door before she could knock, and we stood facing each other on the deck where Bob had posed for photos with Jessica. Emma looked older than her 28 years, worn down by months of defending her father's memory while watching her mother dismantle it piece by piece. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Come in, sweetheart." I stepped aside, watching as she took in the cabin's interior, the rustic furniture, the stone fireplace, the framed photos of landscapes that Bob had chosen with another woman. "Can I make you some coffee?" "I don't want coffee. I want to understand why you're destroying Dad's reputation." Emma remained standing near the door, as if she might flee at any moment. "Michael is devastated. His friends are asking questions about Dad being a criminal. How could you let this happen?" The accusation stung, but I understood her pain. For months, Emma and Michael had watched their father die and their mother fall apart, only to discover that everything they'd believed about their family was built on lies. Emma, I didn't let anything happen. I discovered what your father did, and I had a legal obligation to report it. You could have kept it quiet. You could have protected his memory for us. Her voice cracked, and I saw the little girl who used to run to Bob for comfort when the world seemed unfair. I sat down on the couch, hoping she'd join me. Come here, honey, please. Emma remained standing, but her rigid posture softened slightly. Do you have any idea what this has done to us? Michael won't even talk about Dad anymore. I can't mention him at work because everyone knows about the FBI investigation. You've erased him from our lives. I didn't erase him, Emma. I revealed who he really was. He was our father. The words exploded from her, years of grief and confusion and loyalty crashing together. He taught me to ride a bike. He helped me with my homework. He walked me down the aisle at my wedding. That man existed, Mom. Those memories are real. Tears burned my eyes as I watched my daughter defend the father she'd loved, the same man who'd betrayed everything she thought she knew about him. You're right. That man existed too. Bob was a good father to you and Michael, but he was also a criminal who stole from innocent people. Why couldn't you just let him be remembered as our dad? The question hung between us like a bridge that neither of us knew how to cross. I thought about all the times I'd considered keeping Bob's secrets, protecting my children from the truth, letting them believe in the father they'd adored. Because those innocent people deserve their money back, I said finally, because keeping secrets is what allowed your father to hurt so many people. Because I spent 30 years being married to a stranger, and I won't spend the rest of my life pretending that was okay. Emma finally sat down, her anger deflating into something that looked like exhaustion. I'm so angry at him, Mom, but I'm angry at you, too. I know, I understand that. Do you? Do you understand that you're not the only victim here? Michael and I lost our father twice. Once when he died, and again when we found out who he really was. The truth of her words cut deep. You're right. I was so focused on my own betrayal that I didn't think enough about yours. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us staring at the fireplace where Bob had probably sat with Jessica, planning their future together. Finally, Emma spoke again, her voice smaller than before. I keep wondering if there were signs, if I should have known somehow. Oh, sweetheart. I moved closer to her on the couch. There's no way you could have known. Your father was very good at being different people to different people. Were you happy with him before you found out about everything? The question surprised me with its complexity. I thought I was. But looking back, I think I was happy with who I thought he was, not who he actually was. Emma leaned against my shoulder for the first time since Bob's funeral. I miss believing in him. I know, honey, I miss that too. 6 months after Bob's funeral, I stand in the kitchen of my new apartment, watching the sunrise paint the walls golden through windows that face east. The space is smaller than the house Bob and I shared for 30 years, but every corner belongs entirely to me. There are no locked file cabinets here, no secret phones hidden in drawers, no carefully constructed lies masquerading as love. The apartment overlooks the downtown district where I now work 3 days a week, teaching adult literacy classes at the community college. My students are mostly women like me, women starting over, women who've discovered they're stronger than they knew, women learning that it's never too late to reclaim their own stories. Yesterday, a 57-year-old named Maria read her first complete sentence aloud, and I felt more pride in that moment than I had in decades of being the perfect wife to an imperfect man. The cabin sold last month for substantially more than Bob had paid for it. I used the money to establish the Sarah Chen Foundation for Financial Literacy, providing resources for women who've discovered they don't understand their own finances because someone else has been controlling them. The irony isn't lost on me that Bob's betrayal became the seed for something that helps other women avoid similar deceptions. Emma calls me every Sunday now. Our relationship is different, more honest, less performative. She's in therapy, working through her complicated feelings about her father, and sometimes she asks me questions I'm not sure how to answer. "Do you think he loved us?" she asked last week. I told her the truth. I think Bob loved us in whatever way he was capable of loving, but that his capacity was limited by his selfishness and his lies. Michael has been slower to forgive me, but last month he sent me a card on my birthday with a note that simply said, "Thank you for choosing truth over comfort. It's enough for now." Healing takes time, and some wounds need to scar before they can stop hurting. I've started attending a support group for women who've experienced financial infidelity. Yes, that's apparently a real term with real psychological impacts. The group meets every Tuesday evening in the basement of a Methodist church, and I've learned that Bob's behavior wasn't as unusual as I'd thought. There are dozens of us, women who discovered that the men we trusted most had been lying about money, about relationships, about fundamental aspects of their character. Linda Martinez remains my closest friend, but our dynamic has changed too. I'm no longer the fragile woman seeking refuge in her guest room. I'm someone who survived betrayal and chose to build something better from the wreckage. She jokes that I'm more fun now, more spontaneous, more myself. "It's like you were playing a character for 30 years, she said recently, and now you finally get to be the star of your own life. The most unexpected gift has been solitude. For decades, I defined myself in relation to other people, Bob's wife, Emma, and Michael's mother, the helpful neighbor, the supportive friend. Now, on quiet evenings like this one, I sit with my morning coffee and simply exist as Sarah. Not Sarah Chen, wife of the disgraced accountant. Not Sarah Morrison, the woman who uncovered the financial fraud. Just Sarah, a woman who teaches literacy classes and tends a small balcony garden and reads novels late into the night without anyone questioning her choices. Bob's final confession in that hospital room, "Don't hate me for what you'll find in my office," was meant as an apology, but it became something else entirely. It became permission to stop pretending, to stop protecting everyone else from uncomfortable truths, to stop making myself smaller so that other people could feel bigger. I don't hate Bob. Hatred requires energy I'd rather spend on other things. But I don't miss him either, which surprises me more than anything else. I miss the man I thought he was, the marriage I thought we had, the life I thought we were building together. But that man, that marriage, that life, they were always fiction. The woman I am now, financially independent, emotionally honest, unafraid of difficult conversations, she's not fiction. She's the most real I've ever been. And that's Bob's final gift to me, though I doubt he intended it. In forcing me to discover who he really was, he also forced me to discover who I really am. Sometimes the most devastating betrayal becomes the door to your most authentic life.